Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 319 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. Well, the colonies have finally come back from their trip to the Heathermoors, and it's been a surprising trip in many ways. Stay tuned for my thoughts on exactly what happened and how I feel about it all. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. Hi everyone, it's a beautiful sunny morning here in Norwich, and it's warm too. Warm for September, that's for sure. It is chilly in the mornings though, and that means I'm no longer wearing just a t-shirt. The jumpers and sweatshirts have been brought to the top of the drawer and getting regular use once again. With an eye on the weather, it seems September is going to deliver one of those lovely warm finishes to the summer and early autumn. The next couple of weeks, for me here in Norwich at least, look set fair, with daytime temperatures climbing back into the low 20 degrees Celsius, with clear blue skies and no rain in the forecast of any note. Maybe the odd shower, but nothing significant. Obviously, I'm grabbing the forecast from a highly trusted source, the BBC weather pages, so it could all go to rot very quickly, couldn't it? That said, it gives me the ideal opportunity to carry out one final inspection of every hive to make sure that we're all set for the colder months, that will no doubt be heading our way at some point. As some of you will have heard, we had something of a new learning experience at the beginning of the week. I was going to describe it as a disappointment, but actually, almost immediately I discovered the sad truth of the situation, I immediately felt okay with it, and realised that it's just another example of how, after so many years of beekeeping, there's always something new to experience and learn from. I am talking, of course, about our trip to collect the hives from the Heathermoors. That was on Monday, and boy did it have a major knock-on effect for the rest of the week. Here's what happened, why, and what I learnt from the trip this year. My plan was to get up to the moors as early on Monday as possible. It's a long drive, especially with the trailer hooked up, and dare I say it, my steady driving along with a break or two, it takes around 5 hours or so. I wanted to get there for early afternoon so we could add clearer boards, leave them overnight, remove them the next morning, and return back to Norwich with both supers and hives, thus saving an additional trip up there. Practice makes for an uneventful journey. Nothing to report here, and after a long drive, even negotiating the tracks on the moors was a simple enough process. Absolutely no drama at all, and that makes a pleasant change, if not a terribly exciting podcast for you guys. The immediate job, after Marley had been for a walk of course, was to get the clearer boards on. And this was a routine that we're so familiar with, it's almost a do-it blindfolded kind of job. That is, until Steph lifted the first roof and feeder combo on one of the Technoset hives and discovered there were no bees in the supers at all. Not one. I had a strange feeling of panic. Stolen hives, swarmed bees, dead colonies. All of these things suddenly shot through my mind, only to be somewhat relieved to find a brood box absolutely stuffed full of healthy bees. It turns out it was just really cold. So cold, in fact, that there weren't many bees flying, and that was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We checked the supers and found them to be completely empty, and I do mean completely empty. Not a single cell of any nectar at all. After the shock of this revelation, I removed both the supers and the queen excluder, popped the feeder and roof back on, and moved on to the next colony. I did have a nervous glance at Steph, who looked just as disappointed as me, and we found exactly the same result in the second hive. Nothing, not a drop of honey in either of the supers. This was becoming quite alarming. The third and fourth colonies were pretty much the same. Then a kind of calm descended on us as the realisation that we'd been beaten by the conditions this year finally took hold. Remember, we had created some very strong colonies over the summer to take to the moors. Actually, the process had begun right at the start of the season in selecting colonies we wanted to build up for the heather, so a season-long process had ultimately failed to deliver. We had 18 colonies here on the moors, excepting that we had a box of sections and a box of Ross rounds that we wanted to get filled with honey, both of which failed, I hasten to add. We had put 2 supers on everything, so a total of 36 boxes. Of those 36 boxes, around 8 of them had some honey in them. Of those 8, only 2 had frames that had been capped, and of those frames, none of them had been fully capped. In fact, only one had more than a third of the frame fully capped. To add a further twist, one of the supers had honey in it that was so light you might have thought the bees had been foraging on borage again. Well, maybe not quite that light, but it certainly wasn't heather honey in those cells. I'm looking forward to sampling this small, very small crop to see exactly what it is, under the microscope, of course. I made an executive decision. We weren't going to stay overnight. There was no point. The reason for adding clearer boards was to remove heavy supers so we could lift everything onto the trailer. But with a near complete lack of any honey, the hives weighed the same as when we brought them up. So rather than disturbing the bees and make more work for ourselves, it was far more sensible to just bring them straight back home, settle them for a day or so, and then remove the supers. Add to the fact that overnight it was supposed to blow a gale, with winds forecast to be in the region of 45 miles per hour. I really didn't fancy testing out the roof tent high on the very exposed moors. We stopped for a coffee, drove back to the starting point, and started to load the hives onto the back of the trailer. This was around 4:30 in the afternoon. It was already windy and feeling bitterly cold, no bees flying at all, so it made for a very easy collection. With everything loaded, we headed back to Norwich, arriving at our apiary at around 1-ish in the morning. It was a completely uneventful return journey, a little boring from a storytelling point of view, but much relief from us as beekeepers. So what had happened to make this such a difficult honey production exercise? I know it sounds like a total failure, and if I had a market for my heather honey, it would certainly have been so. But we don't really have any firm commitment to supply heather honey, certainly not locally. Here, our customers prefer to buy our local honey, our Norfolk honey, some of our borage, and we have plenty enough of that this season, thank goodness. Remember, this is only my second time of taking bees to the heather. I much prefer to take the view that it's a learning exercise for both me and Steph, and whatever the outcome, we've learned more and become more experienced in travelling with our bees, along with building the experience of how the heather changes from year to year. There seems to be 2 factors that have seriously and adversely affected our chances of a heather honey crop this year: the weather and that blasted heather beetle. I guess the heather beetle issue had already been flagged up by the gamekeeper, yet I had thought, wrongly as it turns out, that our bees could fly out of the affected area into the unaffected heather as if they were maybe on fields of borage back down in Essex. Our colonies were surrounded by very brown, stressed-out heather plants, barely showing a flower and struggling to grow quickly enough to repair that damage done by the beetle. The other challenge this year appears to have been the weather. I had an opportunity to speak to the gamekeeper as we were leaving, and his comment was very revealing. He said that since we dropped off our bees on the moors, they hadn't had a decent day's weather at all. It had been misty, it had been cold, windy, foggy, wet, and only very briefly had the sun shone. Now that really sounded like a damning indictment of the situation that we found, and most likely the reasons our bees were unable to get away from the hives for any real distance in order to forage. So what have I learnt from this experience? Well, first up, don't sell any honey you haven't got before you get it into buckets or barrels. We have had a few inquiries about heather honey, and I've been putting people off saying that we didn't know what we were likely to have. Imagine if I'd committed myself to supplying someone only to have to go back to them and make a grovelling apology. That would have been a terribly uncomfortable position to be in. At least I made the right call with that. As I mentioned, we had spent a lot of time preparing these colonies for the heather, and actually that helped deliver an increase in summer honey yield despite the lack of heather honey. So actually we should probably think about following our heather routine for all colonies where possible. We could get a general kickback in a bigger summer crop from all colonies. Finally, despite your best efforts, and this probably applies to farming in general, there are always factors outside your control that could easily adversely affect the outcome of whatever project you're embarked upon. In this case, the weather and the heather beetle. I haven't yet extracted what little heather honey we have, but it's reasonable to guess that we may get half to a single bucket of honey from the entire trip. Not great, really, is it? You'll be wondering if I'm ever thinking of going back to the heather moors again, given the time and money that it costs. There's also that knock-on effect of feeling a bit fuzzy for a few days after driving so many miles, and the subsequent lack of sleep. It certainly takes me a considerable amount of time to catch up. The answer is, of course, yes. I can't wait to start planning our next trip. I'm certain I made some major mistakes this year, and I think the location was wrong. We were too high on the moor and surrounded by stressed out plants. In fairness to me, I wasn't aware of how badly this would affect the yield, but I probably should have guessed. Also, I obviously didn't make enough sacrifices to the weather gods, so we'll have to consider something more elaborate. Maybe a beekeeping version of the Wicker Man is required. I already have a plan for relocating colonies next year. We have found a much more sheltered location, and while it might not be immune to the heather beetle, it does seem to have a lot of older heather that apparently the beetle doesn't quite like so much. All of that is very much in a little imaginary box in the back of my head at the moment. We have far more pressing jobs to complete in order to get these colonies ready for winter. One final bit of good news for the colonies from the moors is that they all appear to be healthy, with absolutely no signs of stress or that dreaded CBPV. Thinking about winter preparations, these should be well underway for everyone now. Treatments, if you're using them, should be near completion if they haven't already been finished, and your thoughts should turn to any supplemental feeding you think your colonies might require. This is always a tricky topic to offer up advice on, as colonies are so very different, and depending on what part of the country you live in, we'll see the rate at which food is consumed vary tremendously. Personally, and when we had national hives, I've always left a super full of food on these colonies, placed it beneath the brood box with the queen excluder removed. For commercials, 14 by 12s and Langstroth hives, I've always found them to be of a large enough brood box size to hold enough food for the winter in most situations, with most colonies. That said, I've always found myself popping fondant on them in midwinter, but that seems to be mainly in order to help me sleep through the night rather than because my colonies are starving. With the weather set fair for a couple of weeks, I intend to check all of our colonies for a final time. I have several reasons for doing this, and once completed, I'll know where each colony sits in terms of survivability for the coming colder months. Most colonies that die out through the winter could probably be predicted around now by the beekeeper looking after them, if you just know what to look out for. First off is the colony queen rate. Although egg laying will be slowing down, most queens should still be laying, and you should be able to see this. If not, don't panic. It could be a case of a supersedure queen being in place, or it could be a brood break because of a lack of food. Try giving them a little food supplementation and recheck for eggs in a week's time. Are there any signs of serious disease? Here we're talking foul brood, serious deformed wing virus, probably indicating a varroa issue, or have you got a major CBPV outbreak? The foul brood issue needs bee inspector intervention. The CBPV, if serious, personally, I would destroy them, but the deformed wing virus can be sorted with varroa treatments if you haven't already used them. Finally, how much food do they have? Do you need to supplement with heavy syrup or fondant? Right now, we have a lot of ivy, pollen and nectar coming in, and I like to mix this with a little syrup or fondant as I think it helps keep it liquid for longer. In a couple of weeks, we'll move supers below brood boxes, where we deem it necessary, and entrances will have mouse guards fitted again where necessary. Then we'll sit tight for a month or two, waiting on a brood break so we can treat with oxalic acid. But more of that in future podcasts. Well, that's it for this week. Don't forget to check out my website, www.norfolk-honey.co.uk, and for my latest videos and podcasts with more updates, tips and techniques, it's the same Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey. And remember, I'm Stewart Spinks, and that was Beekeeping Short and Sweet.